Welcome, Wapham crew, new listeners, friends, fiends, family, phantoms, ghouls, gals, guys. Anyone out there that is listening, secure your tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the La Platas on a rocky mountain high, get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners, and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in colorful Colorado. It is Saturday, October 8th, Sunday, October 9th for those of you across the pond and beyond. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, and welcome to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I'm your host, TessaTNT, and we are broadcasting live from the Mile High Clubhouse tonight. I hope you guys have had an awesome weekend so far. Thank you so much for joining us on one of our many forums. If you're listening to us live right now, you may be listening to us on Spreaker.com under We Are Paradox Media. You may also find us live on KPNL Radio at kpnl-db.com, as well as eTalk Radio, which is under etalk.tv/radio. If you want to listen to us on your free time, whether you're working out, or just working in general, feel free to listen to us. You can find us, once again, under We Are Paradox Media, under Spreaker, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Castbox, Tumblr, SoundCloud, TuneIn Radio, Deezer, Podcast Addict, and Podcast Chaser, as well as Podvine. Still waiting on the Amazon thing to come through. If you would, please mosey on over to our YouTube channel, We Are Paradox Media. Follow us, like any video that you've listened to, and leave us any comments, whether it be good, bad, willy-nilly, in the middle, and let us know what guests that you would like us to have on, and I will reach out to them and get them on, or I will try my damnedest. So tonight I have a treat for all my guys and gals out there. Tonight we will be having story time with me, TessaTNT. It's a pretty epic. I don't know if you guys could hear that, but there's a lot of thunder and lightning going on outside. It's very spooky, very creepy. Getting me in the mood to read some Miss Shelley's Frankenstein. So Miss Mary Shelley is the one that wrote Frankenstein, and we actually read a bit from that last week, and then we got into a new group of Reddit, which was Reddit Halloween Stories, since it is the season of Halloween. It's funny, me and my youngest daughter went to Durango. It took forever because it seems like anytime I plan something, which is generally why I don't plan things, things get in the way. So we're waiting for this person, waiting for that person, giving this person a ride, etc., etc. And as soon as we get to town, we try to find gas, but it's just too expensive for me. Like, I'm not going to pay 20 cents more in town when I can pay 20 cents less here in Bayfield. So, we went to the far side of town. We came back, got some McDonald's because that's what Lily wanted. And then we parked, and my daughter's like, "Hey, where are you? We're in town. We're over at this dispensary. Where can we meet you?" And took them about another 20 minutes. So it took us a while to get up on Main Street. But I was dressed up as Jason, and she was dressed up as one of the people from The Purge. She had one of those masks on with the little X's on the eyes, and looked like the sewed up mouth and everything. And it was really fun to do it with her instead of just walking around by myself and feeling kind of awkward. Lily went with me, and we're sitting there waiting, and I peeked out, and I'm like, "Oh, I think that's them." So we both put our masks on, and we're both peeking around the car, and we're peeking down, and this car pulled into the alley, and this is off the corner of College in Maine, the alley right behind there. And it was so funny because this car stopped and we're like, I'm trying to figure out, is this car waiting for another car to back out so they can get a parking spot or what? So we peeked out again and they're still sitting there. And then we peeked out again. I'm like, okay, well, let's just wait a second because maybe we're just freaking somebody out. And turns out it wasn't the car we were waiting for. Yes, it was a white car, almost exactly like the one we were waiting for, but it wasn't exactly the right car. So we're just sitting there, and this lady pulls up, and she stops, and she's like, "You guys are just too scary," and it just made us giggle and laugh. And for the remainder of the time, while we're waiting for them, we have our masks on. We're just hanging out at the car. And when a family would come with little kids, which there was a few, we would take our masks off. Or Lily, instead of taking hers off, she would just hide. Because I'm like, hey, let's not scare this little kid. But yeah, so after that, we went up. We put up flyers, handed out flyers. We went up one side of Main Street, back down the other in Durango, Colorado. And so many people were like, ah, and they weren't afraid of me. Like, I have my makeup on and stuff, and I have my Jason mask mostly on the top of my head because I don't have those cool little foam things that Lily has in hers where it gives you a space in between your mask. Like, my mask is right on my face, and it gets very sweaty in there. But yeah, so we went up and down Main. We saw so many people we knew, so many people we didn't. But yeah, we made a good divot in the 55 flyers that I had for this Face of Horror contest. We had a good time. The most important thing to me is it was me and Lily, and she's my bestest little minion. And I just felt like we had the best time ever as mother and daughter walking up and down Main Street. And um, I'm carrying the flyers and I got the tape. Like I'm wearing my utility black pants that I usually wear for security, but it went really well with my shirt that I was wearing as Jason. So I got my tape and my tacks in one side, I got my charger in the other, everything else. Once we were a couple blocks away from my car, I realized I left my phone somewhere. Thank goodness it did not rain that night because, we just continued on our way and it's like, okay, if we miss a call, we miss a call. If not, it's all good. We already talked to your dad. He told us the grocery list he wanted. Um, but generally, there should be nobody else like really calling us at this point. And we get back, and I'm like, well, remember I reapplied my lipstick and stuff, so I'm wearing, what is this one called? Rum Paradise, I believe. Yeah, let me throw it across the room. Plum Paradise. I'm thinking rum because my mother was just in the Caribbean. And my sister came back with COVID. Hey, happy cruise time. But yeah, Plum Paradise with the black on top of it. And my daughter was asking me, why don't you just wear the black? Well, I like the little tinge of kind of like a purple in there. I like that. Plum color. I don't want to be totally gothic. I just want to look a bit, ominous or creepy or whatnot. But yeah, it was awesome. It's still a lot of tourists. Everybody has summer and tourist season, different times of the year. It's still going on. But we got at least half of our 55 up there. And my husband, being the smartass he is, there really is no half of 25. Well, yes, there is. Yes, there is half of 25. It's a 22 point whatever. Anywho's, basically, I told him about, half of 55. About. Not exactly, but about. But, he's got to get his 2 cents in there. But yeah, Durango was beautiful. I was worried because I was like, man, I ran off half cocked because my daughter's not my youngest, but my other daughter, she's rushing me. Are you ready yet? Are you ready yet? No, you just asked me that like 5 minutes ago. So I just kind of gave up on the whole getting ready thing and I left my jacket behind, and that was kind of worrisome for me because it was cold. But once we got out, I don't know if it was the cloud cover because yes, um there was a lot of rain in Bayfield and other places, but I think in Durango we had the outskirts of the clouds going on. And so it made it a bit warmer. And that one place we were, I believe we went into Old Timers. And I went in there, and I'm not just going to put a flyer up. Like, I'm entitled to put up this flyer. I'm going to ask. Because I don't want to put up my money, my flyer, and then them just rip it down because I didn't ask. And she's like, oh yeah, I put it on this window or this window. And this guy, Richard, who is a part of my crew, and that goes to show you how long it's been since COVID started, since we've had our last real, like, investigation. He comes up and he's looking at me with this look on his face. And I'm like, oh man, he's going to talk to me about my sister Sarah or whatever, because I gave her the boot last year when my husband had COVID really bad. He comes up to me and he's like, what's your name? And I'm like, Tessa? Are you serious right now? And he's like, well, why didn't you say hi, Richard? I'm like, well, first of all, I didn't see you. I'm not wearing my glasses. I can see things up close really good, but I look around and everybody kind of looks the same. You know, I could tell hairstyles and clothes and stuff are different, but I can't tell facial features. So I can't look at a person and be like, oh, look, that's Richard. Besides, Richard looks like he's aged quite a bit, and there's a reason for that. So we have this area here in Durango, Colorado, which is called the Purple Cliffs. And before the Purple Cliffs, a lot of the homeless people were living up near the cemetery in Durango, which is Greenmont Cemetery, or Greenmount, however you want to say it. And that caused a lot of issues, so they began to put them at the Purple Cliffs, which is on the other side of town, right behind the Walmart. You have to walk around the river just to get to Walmart. I'm not sure if they ever built a bridge down there, but you know, there's a walkway and a path that goes down there. But yeah, this last Monday, they actually decided that was the final day to give everybody the boot. So he's really big in the homeless community, and he's been helping people to get the heck out of there. And not only has he been working really, really hard, but so many people, I'm going to say 5 people at less. To me, that's so many, because 5 people or less dying within the last week, that's a lot. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but now it's raining. There's not only thunder and lightning, but now it's raining, which I love. I love the rain. Anywho's, poor Richard, he's like this guy, he was working at the Manna Soup Kitchen, he had a job here, blah, blah, blah. Like, things were really going good for this guy, and he was just found over in this neighborhood dead. And then there's this other person, yada, yada, blah, blah, blah. This person was found dead, and this person, and you know what? You know, methamphetamine and other things, heroin, etc., used to be the epidemic, but it seems like today fentanyl is the real epidemic, not only because it's a very serious drug. I actually had fentanyl when I broke my foot off. And it was quite nice. You know, it really did ease the pain, but people are actually taking this willy-nilly, and there are some that are coming, not some people, but some drugs known as fentanyl coming from Mexico and other places that are producing this that are bad. Now, they're not mixed up quite like the pharmaceutical company would do it. Even when the pharmaceutical company does it, you have to be very, very fucking careful. But the ones that are mixed up by, you know, the hood or on the streets or whatever you want to call it, you even touch the dust on this shit and you're dead. There was actually an article that was saying, if you find money on the street, don't pick it up. Please teach your kids not to pick up money that they find. And this is because people are snorting fentanyl. They're not just taking it. They're crushing it up and snorting it. And sometimes they lose their money. And I know a couple of people that have actually touched the money. One of them just told me their story this last week where she picked up the money and her husband was giving, you know, the whole deal about you shouldn't be doing this, blah, blah, and totally bitching at her. And she's trying to tell him there's something wrong, but he won't shut up. And until she started foaming at the mouth and vomiting, he realized something was wrong. And she ended up surviving, which was good. But how freaking scary is that? I remember when I was a kid, we'd find money sometimes. One time there was 100. This girl I was walking with. Oh, it sounds like there's a little hell in this rain too. Oh, I wish you guys could hear this. It's awesome. Ah, anyways, yeah, she was a little quicker than me. She grabbed that 100. I was very mad about that because I deserved that 100. I'm the one that saw it and pointed it out, but she grabbed it first. I should have just grabbed it. Taught me to shut my mouth. But yeah, it's very, very serious epidemic. So, man, I wonder if I tilt this up if you guys can hear it. Oh, yeah, it's not showing up on the soundboard, but I did put the mic up there just so you guys might be able to hear it. Anywho's, okay, so, last week and I believe the week before, we were talking about my brother-in-law Dave, who wasn't feeling right at the Farmer's Fresh and fell and hit his head. His heart stopped. They did compressions. They didn't do mouth to mouth because everybody these days, it's kind of like, being in kindergarten, first grade, and whatever. People are afraid of cooties, aka COVID, and whatever else may be flying around. So this off-duty officer did compressions, but he didn't give him oxygen, which to me is like, man, that's like basically pointless. You're going to start the heart, but you're not going to give him oxygen, which is going to kill his brain because the blood that's pumping is not oxygenized. Maybe there's the faintest little trace of it in there, but unfortunately this week, Dave was taken off of life support. He was doing okay at first to the fact that he could open his eyes and he could move his eyes around and look at all of us, but he couldn't move. And the only time he really moved was when too much of the medication had worn off and he would start having seizures. And it just got worse and worse and worse. And I'm not going to say against my will because I went willingly. I didn't want to let my husband down. And I even told him that later. And he's like, you wouldn't have let me down. But it makes me feel guilty. Like, I want to be there for him. You know what I mean? And so I went and saw Dave and then went and took the kids to see Dave again. And it's just so freaking sad. It takes me back to when I was 5, almost 6 years old. And my mom was basically in the same condition. Except for she could move, but she couldn't talk. I don't know if you guys heard that lightning. That's pretty close. She could move, but she couldn't talk. And after 2 weeks, my dad took her off of life support too, and that killed him forever. So I worry about Vern, but he had read this article about THC and CBD, which, marijuana has both in it. It's just to different degrees. So he bought some drops for Dave, and yeah, he was giving them a little bit of THC and stuff. He read that THC actually helps brain damaged patients and people in comas, which I don't believe Dave's coma was natural. I believe Dave's coma was medically induced. Hold on, I think my editor is oh, no, that's my daughter calling for Bean. Oh my gosh. So anyways, there was an article that said that THC and CBD can help coma patients and help to revive, like, brain function. Holy shit, that was a loud one. Brain function, etc. And so Vern went and bought some. And the cool thing was, it was called My Brother's Flower. And, so yeah, he was giving Dave a little bit of that every day before he was brought off of his sedation. to try to keep the seizures from getting too hard. And it seemed to work for a little bit, but after a while, the seizures were very, very prevalent, so he couldn't really bring them out anymore. Yeah, it was really bad. The more time went on, the more Dave would start to seize up, the worse it would get. And the last time I was in there, I was talking to the nurse, and she's like, "Oh, did you hear about this case?" And it was about the lady that was on there for about 30 years, and her parents didn't want to let her go, but the husband's like, she doesn't want to be like this. And at that point, I wonder, is the soul really still there, or has it already departed? And this is just the body being kept alive. Um, but yeah, at first I was like, no, I don't remember that. I remembered a case of a younger kid that went through that. But then I was like, oh yeah, I remember. And she's like, yeah, it's like, when there's brain damage and there's damaged brain cells, those dead cells will start to deplete, and, the dead cell thing will start to spread, which is true. I think with that younger kid that I heard about, who was on for about the same time as this lady, he actually pulled out of it. But that's different, I think. When a person is younger, your brain hasn't quite developed, it will actually do it on its own. But yeah, I believe it was, I'm going to say Tuesday around noon. Dave was taken off of life support. Vern gave him the rest of the bottle. And then they pulled the tubes, and then they put on Pink Floyd, and it was Us and Them. And he was talking about how the heart rate would go down, and then it would go up, and then it would go down, and then it would go up. And it was pretty amazing to me, as far as the point that they're both musicians. Vern's a bass player. Dave is a guitar player, one of the best I've ever known or heard. Except for when he got really drunk. Then he got really tinky. He lasted until right to the very end of Us and Them. And then he passed. And another cool thing about that day, not that it was a cool day, but kind of, because Dave didn't want to be like that. But Vern decided to go and get Dave baptized. So Dave was baptized earlier. There was a blessing done. And then they took him off life support, played Us and Them, and then that was the end for Dave. Cool paranormal happening in the house. So that happened. Vern walked away. That was the hard part for me with my dad and everything. Like, for me to walk away, I need to be there until they take the body. I want to make sure everything is done correctly. But Dave passed away. Vern walked away. Vern got into the elevator, and the door was closing. And then as it was almost closed, it opened up again. Like somebody was trying to get in. And Vern's like, well, that's weird, because I didn't see anybody walk up and press the button or anything. So he poked his head out, and he looked around. And so he's thinking that Dave actually got on that elevator with him and left with him. Who knows how long Dave was waiting for that? How long had Dave vacated his body before this even happened, is what I'm wondering, because I know he wasn't in there. That's one of the reasons I couldn't go back. Not only because I felt traumatized, because that's how my mom was, but because I just knew he wasn't in there, and he didn't want anybody to see him like that. But I wasn't going to keep that from the kids, so I took the kids up, and that's mostly why I went up both those times. But rest in peace, David Allen Peterson. His funeral, I believe, is going to be this Tuesday around 11:30. Let's say like noon to 1 or 2. You know, things in this realm, as far as being a Peterson and a Thomas, never happen on time, but they happen when they're supposed to. I would do a Facebook Live on my Facebook, but I've been grounded because I posted Joe Biden's son smoking a joint in the bathtub. You really can't see anything, but politically correct Facebook decided, this goes against community standards. And it said sexual violence. And I'm looking at this picture, and it's Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, is that his name? with his hands across his chest so you can't even see his nipples. His face is turned to the side. He looks so completely relaxed, and he has a mostly burnt joint in his mouth. There's nothing wrong with this picture. The font was saying, well, I hope gas prices aren't as high as this or whatever. It was Joe Biden's son in the bathtub, so I guess, they're paid off politically, so therefore I couldn't share it. And it feels like time hasn't passed. I'm hoping I didn't vote for her at any point. Freaking weird. Oh wow, I got 13 new different family members that just joined 23andMe. Alright, so on that note, rest in peace, Dave. There is a thing that he wrote that I typed up that I want to find. I just can't find exactly where I put it. But if I find it, I want to read it to you guys. But on that note, let's get to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I love the rain. It's amazing. Oh, there's my bookmark. Frankenstein, Chapter 1. Uh-oh, I gotta look up here. I just gotta... Hello, beautiful Sister Sandra. Thank you for voting this week. Oh yeah, I totally forgot to do that, since we got a couple more minutes before 30 passed. Let me remind you guys, I'm in the Face of Horror contest. If I don't make it to first place this week, I'm a goner. So, if you'd like to go to faceofhorror.org/2022/Tessa, TESSA, dash Thomas, THOMAS, dash Peterson, PETERSON, and vote, that'd be great. You could do a free vote, which is the black button, or you can do a scare vote, which costs money, but at least, so that doesn't mean 25%, but at least 25%. So I'm thinking it's going to be a little bit more than that, or more than that, goes to the B Plus Foundation, which is for infantile cancer, kids cancer, and for their families and all the craziness they have to go through. It makes me really sad that kids have to go through that. It's storming here. That thunder and lightning is really getting me in the mood for this Frankenstein. But once again, if you would go and vote, if you are in this area, we are going to do free interactive ghost hunt on Halloween as well as November 8th. On November 8th is our free full moon ghost hunt. Location, we still haven't decided because that's going to be by popular vote of what everybody in the group wants to do. Whatever gets the most votes is where we'll go. But that's at faceofhorror.org/2022/Tessa-Thomas-Peterson. Thank you so much for voting for me, for supporting me. Like I said, if I don't make it to first, I'm in second at this point. Today, it's 2 times scare votes, so whatever you pay, you get 2 times that. So this is the epic time to do it. I believe they might do it again further into the week. Oh my gosh, that thunder and lightning is intense. So further in the week, they'll probably do it again. But thank you again, Sandra and Robert and Nick. And man, there's so many people that have been helping me out and voting for me, and I love it. I love the support. Vern, he still doesn't believe it's true. He's like, nope, when I first heard about it, I thought it was a scam, because how many people do I know are doing it? How many people do you know? 2. 2 whole people, and you think it's a scam? There's thousands of people doing this. Whatever. Like Beavis said, the street shall flow with the blood of the non-believers. Are you threatening my bunkor? I need teepee for my bunkor. I love the fact that they brought Beavis and Butthead back on Paramount. I just watched it the other night, and it took me back to the good old days. So let's continue on with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We're at chapter 1. I am, by birth, a Genovese, and my family is one of the most distinguished of that republic. My ancestors had been for many years counselors and syndics, and my father had filled several public situations with honor and reputation. He was respected by all who knew him for his integrity and indefatigable attention to public business. He passed his younger days perpetually occupied by the affairs of his country. A variety of circumstances had prevented his marrying early. Not was it until the decline of life that he became a husband and the father of a family. As the circumstances of his marriage illustrate his character, I cannot refrain from relating them. One of his most intimate friends was a merchant who, from a flourishing state, fell, through numerous mischances, into poverty. This man, whose name was Beaufort, was a proud and unbending disposition, and could not bear to live in poverty and oblivion in the same country where he had formerly been a distinguished person for his rank and magnificence. Having paid his debts, therefore, in the most honorable manner, he retreated with his daughter to the town of Lucerne, where he lived unknown and in wretchedness. My father loved Beaufort with the truest friendship, and was deeply grieved by his retreat in these unfortunate circumstances. He bitterly deplored the false pride which led his friend to a conduct so little worthy of the affection that united them. He lost no time in endeavoring to seek him out, with the hope of persuading him to begin in the world again through his credit and assistance. Beaufort had taken effectual measures to conceal himself, and it was 10 months before my father discovered his abode. Enjoyed at his discovery, he hastened to the house, which was situated in a mean street near the Ruse. But when he entered, misery and despair alone welcomed him. Beaufort had saved but a very small sum of money from the wreck of his fortunes, but it was sufficient to provide him with the sustenance for some months, and in the meantime he hoped to procure some respectable employment in the merchant's house. The interval was consequently spent in inaction. His grief only became more deep and rankling when he had leisure for reflection, and thought it took so fast hold of his mind that at the end of 3 months he lay on a bed of sickness, incapable of any exertion. His daughter attended him with the greatest tenderness, but she saw with despair that their little fund was rapidly decreasing, and that there was no other prospect of support. But Caroline Beaufort possessed a mind of an uncommon mould, and her courage rose to support her in her adversity. She procured plain work, she plaited straw, and by various means contrived to earn a pittance scarcely sufficient to support life. Several months passed in this manner. Her father grew worse, her time was more entirely occupied in attending him, her means of subsistence decreased. In the 10th month her father died in her arms, leaving her an orphan and a beggar. This last blow overcame her, and she knelt by Beaufort's coffin, weeping bitterly. When my father entered the chamber, he came like a protection spirit to the poor girl, who committed herself to his care, and after the interment of his friend he conducted her to Geneva, and placed her under the protection of a relation. 2 years after this event, Caroline became his wife. There was a considerable difference between the ages of my parents, but this circumstance seemed to unite them only closer in bonds of devoted affection. There was a sense of justice in my father's upright mind, which rendered it necessary that he should approve highly to loving and loving strongly. Perhaps during former years he had suffered from the late discovered unworthiness of one beloved, and so was disposed to set a greater value on tried worth. There was a show of gratitude and worship in his attachment to my mother, differing wholly from the doting fondness of age, for it was inspired by reverence for her virtues and a desire to be the means of, in some degree, recompensing her for the sorrows she had endured, but which gave inexpressible grace to his behavior to her. Everything was made to yield to her wishes and her convenience. He strove to shelter her as a fair exotic is sheltered by the gardener, for every rougher wind, and to surround her with all that could tend to excite pleasurable emotion in her soft and benevolent mind. Her health, and even the tranquillity of her hitherto constant spirit, had been shaken by what she had gone through. During the 2 years that had elapsed previous to their marriage, my father had gradually relinquished all his public functions, and immediately after their union they sought the pleasant climate of Italy, and the change of scene and interest attendant on a tour through that land of wonders, as a restorative for her weakened frame. From Italy they visited Germany and France. I, their eldest child, was born at Naples, and as an infant accompanied them in their rambles. I remained for several years their only child. Much as they were attached to each other, they seemed to draw inexhaustible stores of affection from a very mine of love to bestow them upon me. My mother's tender caresses and my father's smile of benevolent pleasure while regarding me are my first recollections. I was their plaything and their idol and something better, their child, the innocent and helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven, whom to bring up to good, and whose future lot it was in their hands to direct to happiness or misery, according as they fulfilled their duties towards me. With this deep consciousness of what they owed towards the being to which they had given life, added to the active spirit of tenderness that animated both, it may be imagined that while during every hour of my infant life I received a lesson of patience, of charity, of self-control, I was so guided by a silken cord that all seemed but one train of enjoyment to me. For a long time I was their only care. My mother had much desire to have a daughter, but I continued their single offspring. When I was about 5 years old, while making an excursion beyond the frontiers of Italy, they passed a week on the shores of the Lake of Como. Their benevolent disposition often made them enter the cottages of the poor. This, to my mother, was more than a duty. It was a necessity, a passion, remembering what she had suffered and how she had been received. For her to act in her turn the guardian angel to the afflicted. During one of their walks, a poor cot in the foldings of a veil attracted their notice as being singularly disconsolate, while the number of half-clothed children gathered about it spoke of penury in its worst shape. One day, when my father had gone by himself to Milan, my mother, accompanied by me, visited this abode. She found a peasant and his wife, hard-working, bent down by care and labor, distributing a scanty meal to 5 hungry babes. Among these there was one which attracted my mother far above all the rest. She appeared of a different stock. The 4 others were dark-eyed, hardy little vagrants. This child was thin and very fair. Her hair was the brightest living gold, and despite the poverty of her clothing, seemed to set a crown of distinction on her head. Her brow was clear and ample, her blue eyes cloudless, and her lips and moulding of her face was expressive of sensibility and sweetness that none could behold her without looking on her as of a distinct species, a being heaven sent, and bearing a celestial stamp in all her features. The peasant woman, perceiving that my mother fixed eyes of wonder and admiration on this lovely girl, eagerly communicated her history. She was not her child, but the daughter of a Milanese nobleman. Her mother was a German, and had died on giving her birth. The infant had been placed with these good people to nurse. They were better off then. They had not been long married, and their eldest child was but just born. The father of their charge was one of those Italians nursed in the memory of the antique glory of Italy, one among the Schiavi Ognor Frementi, which exerted himself to obtain the liberty of his country. He became the victim of its weakness. Whether he had died or still lingered in the dungeons of Austria was not known. His property was confiscated. His child became an orphan and a beggar. She continued with her foster parents and bloomed in their rude abode, fairer than a garden rose among dark levelled brambles. When my father returned from Milan, he found playing with me in the hall of our villa a child fairer than a pictured cherub, a creature who seemed to shed radiance from her looks, and whose form and motions were lighter than the chamois of the hills. The apparition was soon explained. With his permission, my mother prevailed on her rustic guardians to yield their charge to her. They were fond of the sweet orphan. Her presence had seemed a blessing to them, but it would be unfair to her to keep her in poverty and want, when Providence afforded her such powerful protection. They consulted their village priest, and the result was that Elizabeth Lavenza became the inmate of my parents' house. My more than sister, the beautiful and adored companion of all my occupants and my pleasures. Everyone loved Elizabeth. The passionate and most reverential attachment with which all regarded her became, while I shared it, my pride and my delight. On the evening previous to her being brought to my home, my mother had said playfully, "I have a pretty little present for my Victor. Tomorrow he shall have it." And when, on the morrow, she presented Elizabeth to me as her promised gift, I, on the morrow, with my childish seriousness, interpreted her words literally and looked upon Elizabeth as mine to protect, love, and cherish. All praises bestowed on her I received as made to a possession of my own. We called each other familiarly by the name of cousin. No word, no expression could body forth the kind of relation in which she stood to me, my more than sister, since till death she was to be mine only. Chapter 2. We were brought up together. There was not quite a year difference in our ages. I need not say that there were strangers to any species of disunion or dispute. Harmony was the soul of our companionship, and the diversity and contrast that subsisted in our characters drew us nearer together. Elizabeth was of a calmer and more concentrated disposition, but withal my adorer. I was capable of more intense application, and was more deeply smitten with a thirst for knowledge. She busied herself with following the aerial creations of the poets and in the majestic and wondrous scenes which surrounded our Swiss home, the sublime shapes of the mountains, the changes of the seasons, tempest and calm, the silence of winter, and the life of turbulence of our Alpine summers. She found ample score for admiration and delight. While my companion contemplated, with a serious and satisfied spirit, the magnificent appearances of things, I delighted in investigating their causes. The world was to me a secret which I desired to divine. Curiosity, earnest research to learn the hidden laws of nature, gladness akin to rapture, as they were unfolded to me, are among the earliest sensations I can remember. On the birth of a second son, my junior by 7 years, my parents gave up entirely their wandering life, and fixed themselves in their native country. We possessed a house in Geneva, and a campagne in Bellerive, the eastern shore of the lake, at the distance of rather more than a league from the city. We resided principally in the latter, and the lives of my parents were passed in considerable seclusion. It was my temper to avoid a crowd, and to attach myself fervently to a few. I was indifferent, therefore, to my schoolfellows in general, but I united myself in the bonds of the closest friendship to one among them. Henry Clerval was the son of a merchant in Genevieve. He was a boy of singular talent and fancy. He loved enterprise, hardship, and even danger for its own sake. He was a deeply read person in books of chivalry and romance. He composed heroic songs, and began to write many a tale of enchantment and knightly adventure. He tried to make us act plays, and to enter into masquerades, in which the characters were drawn from the heroes of Roncesvalles, of the Round Table of King Arthur, and the chivalrous train who shed their blood to redeem the Holy Sepulchre from the hands of the infidels. No human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself. My parents were possessed by the very spirit of kindness and indulgence. We felt that they were not the tyrants to rule our lot according to their caprice, but the agents and creators of all the many delights which we enjoyed. When I mingled with other families, I distinctly discerned how peculiarly fortunate my lot was, and gratitude assisted the development of filial love. My temper was sometimes violent, and my passions vehement, but, by some law in my temperature, they were turned not towards childish pursuits, but to an eager desire to learn, and not to learn all things indiscriminately. I confess that neither the structure of languages, nor the code of governments, nor the politics of various states possessed attractions for me. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn, and whether it was the outward substance of things, or the inner spirit of nature and the mysterious soul of man that occupied me. Still, my inquiries were directed to the metaphysical, or, in its highest sense, the physical secrets of the world. Meanwhile, Clerval occupied himself, so to speak, with the moral relations of things, the busy stage of life. The virtues of heroes and the actions of men were his theme, and his hope and his dream was to become one among those whose names are recorded in story as the gallant and adventurous benefactors of our species. The saintly soul of Elizabeth shone like a shrine-dedicated lamp in our peaceful home. Her sympathy was ours, her smile, her soft voice, the sweet glance of her celestial eyes were ever there to bless and animate us. She was the living spirit of love to soften and attract. I might have become sullen in my study, rough through the ardor of my nature, but that she was there to subdue me to a semblance of her own gentleness. And Clerval could aught I'll entrench on the noble spirit of Clerval. Yet he might not have been so perfectly humane, so thoughtful in his generosity, so full of kindness and tenderness amidst his passion for adventurous exploit, had he not unfolded to him the real loveliness of beneficence, and made the doing good an end the aim of his soaring ambition. I feel exquisite pleasure in dwelling on the recollections of childhood, before misfortune had tainted my mind, and changed its bright vision of extensive usefulness into gloomy and narrow reflections upon self. Besides, in drawing the picture of my early days, I also record those events which led by insensible steps to my aftertale of misery. For when I would account to myself for the birth of that passion which afterwards ruled my destiny, I find it arise like a mountain river from ignoble and almost forgotten sources, but swelling as it proceeded, it became the torrent which, in its course, was swept away all my hopes and joys. Natural philosophy is the genius that has regulated my fare. I desire, therefore, in this narration, to state those facts which led to my predilection for the science. When I was 13 years of age, we all went on a party of pleasure to the baths near Thonon. The inclemency of the weather obliged us to remain a day confined to the inn. In this house I chanced to find a volume of the works of Cornelius Agrippa. I opened it with empathy. The theory which he attempts to demonstrate and the wonderful facts which he relates soon changed this feeling into enthusiasm. A new light seemed to dawn upon my mind, and bounding with joy, I communicated my discovery to my father. My father looked carelessly at the title page of my book and said, "Ah, Cornelius Agrippa. My dear Victor, do not waste your time upon this. 'Tis sad trash." If, instead of this remark, my father had taken the pains to explain to me that the principles of Agrippa had been entirely exploded, and that a modern system of science had been introduced, which possessed much greater powers than the ancient, because the powers of the latter were chimerical, while those of the former were real and practical. Under such circumstances, I should certainly have thrown Agrippa aside and have contented my imagination, warmed as it was, by returning with greater ardor to my former studies. It is even possible that the train of my ideas would never have received the fatal impulse that led to my ruin. But the cursory glance my father had taken for my volume by no means assured me that he was acquainted with its contents, and I continued to read with the greatest avidity. When I returned home, my first care was to procure the whole works of this author, and afterwards of Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus. I read and studied the wild fancies of these writers with delight. They appeared to me treasures known to few beside myself. I have described myself as always having been imbued with a fervent longing to penetrate the secrets of nature, in spite of the intense labor and wonderful discoveries of modern philosophers. I always came from my studies discontented and unsatisfied. Sir Isaac Newton is said to have avowed that he felt like a child picking up shells beside the great and unexplored ocean of truth. Those of his successors in each branch of natural philosophy with whom I was acquainted appeared even to my boy's apprehensions as tyros engaged in the same pursuit. We're not quite done with that chapter, but it is time to go to our first music break. On this break, we are going to be listening to Miss Mia Savage, Antidote for Savages. Yes, I know, I generally do that when I do story time or I do Jeff Hilliard or somebody who is a long music break, but I just so love her music and her energy, so I just couldn't help myself. So instead of doing the same lineup I usually do, I kind of just reversed it. So in this one, she's going to be singing to your grave, your skeleton, bury me in heaven, and our new reality. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this musical break. Welcome back, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. Hope you guys are having a wonderful time so far. I am. I'm really enjoying Mary Shelley's Frankenstein so far. Before we go back into that, we're going to go back to the Face of Horror contest I'm in. Tonight is 2 times votes. So if you spend $10 on scare votes, you actually get 20. And like I said before, at least 25% of that goes to the B Plus Foundation for infantile cancer, aka kids with cancer and their families that are having to go through this hardship. Don't forget, if you do pay for scare votes, you also get 2 votes on top of that. If you have verified through Facebook or anything else like that, you only get 1 vote per day. If you do it through your credit card, whether you pay or not, you get 2. So that's a pretty interesting piece of information there. So the link for that is faceofhorror.org/2022/Tessa-Thomas-Peterson. That is faceofhorror.org/2022/Tessa-Thomas-Peterson. And that was Miss Mia Savage on our music break with Antidote for Savages. Like I said, I kind of wrestled over that. I'm like, who can I use for my music break? And generally hers is the longest. Jeff Hilliard's is second longest. But I love both of those guys so very much. I love their music. I love their creativity. I love everything about them as people. They're amazing. So let us go back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I do believe we're on chapter 2. I feel exquisite pleasure in dwelling on the recollections of childhood, before misfortune had tainted my mind, and changed its bright visions of extensive usefulness into gloomy and narrow reflections upon itself. Besides in drawing the early picture of my early days, I also record those events which led, by insensible steps, to my after-tale of misery. For when I would account to myself for the birth of that passion which afterwards ruled my destiny, I find it arise, like a mountain river, from noble and almost forgotten sources. But swelling as it proceeded, it became the torrent which in its course has swept away my hopes and joys. Natural philosophy is the genius that has regulated my fate. I desire, therefore, in this narration to state those facts which led to my predilection for the science. When I was 13 years of age, we all went on a party of pleasure to the baths near Thunen. The inclemency of the weather obliged us to remain a day confined in the inn. In this house I chanced to find a volume of works of Cornelius Agrippa. Yes, I read that, so I think we were on this page. His father said it was trash, didn't really give any sort of real theory to it, so he continued on to look in other people in that field. So the untaught, the untaught peasant beheld the elements around him, and was acquainted with their practical uses. The most learned philosopher knew little more. He had partially unveiled the face of nature, but her immortal lineaments were still a wonder and a mystery. He might dissect, anatomize, and give names, but not to speak of a final cause. Causes in their secondary and tertiary grades were utterly unknown to him. I had gazed upon the fortifications and impediments that seemed to keep human beings from entering the citadel of nature, and rationally and ignorantly I had repined. But here were books, and here were men who had penetrated deeper and knew more. I took their word for all that they had averred, and I became more of their disciple. It may appear strange that such should arise in the 18th century, but while I followed the routine of education in the schools of Geneva, I was, to a great degree, self-taught with regard to my favorite studies. My father was not scientific, and I was left to struggle with a child's blindness, added to a student's thirst for knowledge. Under the guidance of my new preceptors, I entered with the greatest diligence into the search of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, but the latter soon obtained my undivided attention. Wealth was an inferior object. But what glory would attend the discovery, if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death? Nor were these my only visions. The raisings of ghosts or devils was a promise liberally accorded to my favorite authors, the fulfillment of which I most eagerly sought, and if my incantations were always unsuccessful, I attribute the failure rather to my own experience and mistake, than to a want of skill or fidelity in my instructors. And thus, for a time, I was occupied by exploded systems, mingling like an inadept 1,000 contradictory theories, and floundering desperately in a very slough of multifarious knowledge, guided by an ardent imagination and childish reasoning, till an accident again changed the current of my ideas. When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Bellerive, when we witnessed a most violent and terrible thunderstorm. It advanced from behind the mountains of Jura, and the thunder burst at once with frightful loudness from various quarters of the heavens. I remained, while the storm lasted, watching its progress with curiosity and delight. As I stood at the door, on a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak, which stood about 20 yards from our house, and so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared, and nothing remained but a blasted stump. When we visited it the next morning, we found the tree shattered in a singular manner. It was not splintered by the shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. I never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. Before this, I was not acquainted with the more obvious laws of electricity. On this occasion, a man of great research in natural philosophy was with us, and excited by this catastrophe, he entered on the explanation of a theory which he had formed on the subject of electricity and galvanism, which was at once new and astonishing to me. All that he said threw greatly into the shade Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus, or Celsus, the lords of my imagination, but by some fatality, the overthrow of these men disinclined me to pursue my accustomed studies. It seemed to me as if nothing would or could ever be known. All that had so long engaged my attention suddenly grew despicable, by one of those caprices of the mind which we are perhaps most subject to in early youth. I at once gave up my former occupations, set down natural history and all my progeny as a deformed and abortive creation, and entertained the greatest disdain for a would-be science which could never even step within the threshold of real knowledge. In this mood of mind I betook myself to the mathematics and the branches of study appertaining to that science, as being built upon secure foundations, and so worthy of my consideration. Thus strangely are our souls constructed, and by such slight ligaments are we bound to prosperity or ruin. When I look back, it seems to me as if this almost miraculous change of inclination and will was the immediate suggestion of the guardian angel of my life, the last effort made by the spirit of preservation to avert the storm that was even then hanging in the stars and ready to envelop me. Their victory was announced by an unusual tranquillity and gladness of soul, which followed the relinquishing of my ancient and latterly tormenting studies. It was thus that I was to be taught to associate evil with their prosecution, happiness with their disregard. It was a strong effort of the spirit of good, but it was ineffectual. Destiny was too potent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction. Chapter 3. When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt. I had hitherto attended the schools of Geneva, but my father thought it necessary, for the completion of my education, that I should be made acquainted with other customs than those of my native country. My departure was therefore fixed at an early date, but before the day resolved upon could arrive, the first misfortune of my life occurred, an omen, as it were, of my future misery. Elizabeth had caught the scarlet fever. Her illness was severe, and she was in the greatest danger. During her illness, many arguments had been argued to persuade my mother to refrain from attending upon her. She had at first yielded to our entreaties, but when she heard that the life of her favorite was menaced, she could no longer control her anxiety. She attended her sick bed. Her watchful attentions triumphed over the malignity of the distemper. Elizabeth was saved, but the consequences of this imprudence were fatal to her persevere. On the third day my mother sickened. Her fever was accompanied by the most alarming symptoms, and the looks of her medical attendants prognosticated the worst event. On her deathbed, the fortitude and benignity of this best of women did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. "My children," she said, "my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to my younger children. Alas, I regret that I am taken from you, and, happy and beloved as I have been, is it not hard to quit you all? But these are not thoughts befitting me. I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and would indulge a hope of meeting you in another world." She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. I need not describe the feelings of those whose dearest ties are rent by that most irreparable evil, the void that presents itself to the soul, and the despair that is exhibited on the countenance. It is so long before the mind can persuade itself that she, whom we saw every day, and whose very existence appeared a part of our own, can have departed for ever, that the brightness of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and that the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to our ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. These are the reflections of the first days, but when the lapse of time proves the reality of evil, then the actual bitterness of grief commences. Yet from whom has not that rude hand rent away some dear annexation? And why should I describe a sorrow which all have felt, and must feel? The time at length arrives when grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity, and the smile that plays upon the lips, although it may be deemed a sacrilege, is not banished. My mother was dead, but we had still duties which we ought to perform. We must continue our course with the rest, and think ourselves fortunate, whilst one remains whom the spoiler had not seized. My departure for Ingolstadt, which had been referred by these events, was now again determined upon. I obtained from my father a respite of some weeks. It appeared to me sacrilege so soon to leave the repose, akin to death, of the house of mourning, and to rush into the thick of life. I was new to sorrow, but it did not the less alarm me. I was unwilling to quit the side of those who remained to me, and above all, I desired to see my sweet Elizabeth in some degree consoled. She indeed veiled her grief, and strove to act comforter to us all. She looked steadily on life, and assumed its duties with courage and zeal. She devoted herself to those whom she had been taught to call her uncle and cousins. Never was she so enchanted at this time, when she recalled the sunshine of her smiles and spent them upon us. She forgot even her own regret in her endeavours to make us forget. The day of my departure at length arrived. Clerval spent the last evening with us. He had endeavoured to persuade his father to permit him to accompany me and to become my fellow student, but in vain. His father was a narrow-minded trader, and saw idleness and ruin in the aspirations and ambitions of his son. Henry deeply felt the misfortune of being debarred from a liberal education. He said little, but when he spoke, I read in his kindling eye and in his animated glance a restraining but firm resolve, not to the chained to the miserable details of commerce. We sat late. We could not tear ourselves away from each other, nor persuade ourselves to say the word farewell. It was said, and we retired under the pretence of seeking response, each fancying that the other was deceived. But when at morning's dawn I descended to the carriage which was to convey me away, they were all there. My father again to bless me, Clerval to press my hand once more, my Elizabeth to renew her entreaties that I would write often, and to dispose the last feminine attentions in her playmate and friend. I threw myself in the chaise that was to convey me away, and indulging in the most melancholy reflections. I, who had not been surrounded by amiable companions, continually engaged in endeavouring to dispose mutual pleasure, I was now alone. In the university, whither I was going, I must form my own friends and be my own protector. My life had hitherto been remarkably secluded and domestic, and this had given me invincible repugnance to new continences. I loved my brothers, Elizabeth and Clerval. These were old familiar faces, but I believed myself totally unfitted for the company of strangers. Such were my reflections as I commenced my journey, but as I proceeded my spirits and hopes rose. I ardently desired an acquisition of knowledge. I had often, when at home, thought it hard to remain during my youth cooped up in one place, and had longed to enter the world, and take my station among other human beings. Now my desires were complied with, and it would indeed have been folly to repent. I had sufficient leisure for these and many other reflections during my journey to Ingolstadt, which was long and fatiguing. At length the high white steeple of the town met my eyes. I alighted, and was conducted to my solitary apartment, to spend the evening as I pleased. The next morning I delivered my letters of introduction, and paid a visit to some of the principal professors. Chance, or rather the evil influence, the angel of destruction, which exerted omnipotent sway over me from the moment I turned my reluctant steps from my father's door, led me first to M. Crimp, professor of natural philosophy. He was an uncouth man, but deeply imbued in the secrets of his science. He asked me several questions concerning my progress in the different branches of science appertaining to natural philosophy. I replied carelessly, and partly in contempt, mentioned the names of my alchemists as the principal authors I had studied. The professor stared. "Have you," he said, "really spent your time in studying such nonsense?" I replied in the affirmative. "Every minute," continued Mr. Crimp with warmth. "Every instance that you have wasted on those books is utterly entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God, in what desert land have you lived, where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies which you have greedily imbibed are 1,000 years old and as musty as they are ancient? A little expected in this enlightened and scientific age to find a principle of Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew." So saying, he stepped aside and wrote down a list of several books treating of natural philosophy, which he desired me to procure, and demised me after mentioning that in the beginning of the following week he intended to commence a course of lectures upon natural philosophy and its general relations, and that M. Waldman, a fellow professor, would lecture upon chemistry the alternate days that he omitted. I returned home not disappointed, for I have said that I had long considered these authors useless whom the professor reprobated, but I returned not at all the more inclined to recur to these studies in any shape. M. Kemp was a little squat man with a gruff voice and repulsive countenance. The teacher, therefore, did not repossess or prepossess me in favor of his pursuits, in rather a too philosophical and connected a strain. Perhaps I have given an account of the conclusions I had come to concern them in my early years. As a child, I had not been content with the results promised by the modern professors of natural science, with a confused knowledge alone. If your wish is become really a man of science and not merely a pretty experimentalist, I should advise you to apply every branch of natural philosophy, including mathematics. He then took me into his laboratory and explained to me the uses of his various machines, instructing me as to what I ought to procure, and promised me the use of his own when I should have advanced far enough in the science to derange their mechanism. He also gave me the list of books which I had requested, and I took my leave. Thus ended a day memorable to me. I decided my future destiny. Chapter 4. From this day natural philosophy, and particularly chemistry in the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation. I read with ardor those works, so full of genius and discrimination, which modern inquiries have written on these subjects. I attended the lectures, and cultivated the acquaintance of the men of science of the university, and I found even in M. Crimp a great deal of sound sense and real information, combined, it is true, with a repulsive physiognomy and manners, but not on that account the less valuable. In M. W. Waldman I found a true friend. His gentleness was never tinged by dogmatism, and his instructions were given with an air of frankness and good nature that banished every idea of pedantry. In 1,000 ways he smoothed for me the path of knowledge, and made the most abstruse inquiries clear and facile to my apprehension. My application was at first fluctuating and uncertain. It gained strength as I proceeded, and soon became so ardent and eager that the stars often disappeared in the light of the morning, whilst I was yet engaged in my laboratory. As I applied so closely, it may be easily conceived that my progress was rapid. My ardor was indeed the astonishment of the students, and my proficiency that of the master. Professor Crimp often asked me, with a sly smile, how Cornelius Agrippa went on, whilst M. Walden expressed the most heartfelt exultation in my progress. 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva, but was engaged heart and soul in the pursuit of some discoveries which I hoped to make. None but those who have experienced them can conceive of the enticements of science. In other studies you go as far as others have gone before you, and there is nothing more to know. But in a scientific pursuit there is continual food for discovery and wonder. A mind of moderate capacity, which closely pursued one study, must infallibly arrive at great proficiency in that study, and I, who continually sought the attainment of one object of pursuit, and was solely wrapped up in this, improved so rapidly that, at the end of 2 years, I made some discoveries in the improvement of some chemical instruments, which procured me great esteem and admiration at the university. When I had arrived at this point, and had become as well acquainted with the theory and practice of natural philosophy as depended on the lessons of any of the professors at Ingolstadt, my residence there being no longer conducive or conductive to my improvements, I thought of returning to my friends and my native town, when an incident happened that protracted my stay. One of the phenomena which had peculiarly attracted my attention was the structure of the human frame, and, indeed, any animal endued with life, whence I often asked myself, did the principle of life proceed? It was a bold question, and one which has even been considered as a mystery. Yet with how many things are we upon the brink of becoming acquainted, if cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries? I revolved these circumstances in my mind, and determined thenceforth to apply myself more particularly to those branches of natural philosophy which relate to physiology. Unless I had been animated by an almost supernatural enthusiasm, my application to this study would have been irksome, and almost intolerable. To examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death. I became acquainted with the science of anatomy, but this was not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. In my education, my father had taken the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not ever remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition, or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. Darkness had no effect upon my fancy, and a churchyard was to me merely the receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which, from being the seat of beauty and strength, had become food for a worm. Now I was led to examine the cause and progress of this decay, and forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. My attention was fixed upon every object the most insupportable to the delicacy of the human feelings. I saw how the fine form of man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeed to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and brain. I paused, examining and analyzing all the minutiae of the causation, as exemplified in the change from life to death, and death to life, until, from the midst of this darkness, a sudden light broke upon me, a light so brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple, that while I became dizzy with the immensity of the prospect which it illustrated, I was surprised that among so many men of genius who had directed their inquiries towards the same science, that I alone should be reserved to discover so astonishing a secret. Remember, I am not recording the vision of a madman. The sun does not more certainly shine in the heavens than that which I now affirm is true. Some miracle might have produced it, yet the stages of the discovery were distinct and probable. After days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. The astonishment which I had at first experienced on this discovery soon gave place to delight and rapture. After so much time spent in painful labor to arrive at once at the summit of my desires, was the most gratifying consummation of my toils. But this discovery was so great and overwhelming that all the steps by which I had been progressively led to it were obliterated, and I beheld only which I had been progressively led to. What had been the study and desire of the wisest men since the creation of the world was now within my grasp. Not that, like a magic scene, it all opened upon me at once. The information I had attained was of a nature rather to direct my endeavors so soon as I should point them towards the object of my search, than to exhibit the object already accomplished. I was like the Arabian who had been buried with the dead and found a passage to life, aided only by one glimmering and seemingly ineffectual light. I see by your eagerness and the wonder and hope which your eyes express, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret with which I am acquainted. That cannot be. Listen patiently until the end of my story, and you will easily perceive why I am reserved upon that subject. I will not lead you on, unguarded and ardent as I then was, to your destruction and infallible misery. Learn from me, if not from my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world, than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. When I found so astonishing a power placed within my hands, I hesitated a long time concerning the manner in which I should employ it. Although I possessed the capacity of bestowing animation, yet to prepare a frame for the reception of it, with all its intricacies of fibers, muscles, and veins, still remained a work of inconceivable difficulty and labor. I doubted at first whether I should attempt the creation of being like myself, or one of simpler organization, but my imagination was too much exalted by my first success to permit me to doubt of my ability to give life to an animal as complex and wonderful as man. The materials at present within my command hardly appeared adequate to so arduous an undertaking, but I doubted not that I should ultimately succeed. I prepared myself for a multitude of reverses. My operations might be incessantly baffled, and at last my work to be imperfect. Yet, when I considered the improvement which every day takes place in science and mechanics, I was encouraged to hope my present attempts would at least lay foundations of future success. Nor could I consider the magnitude and complexity of my plan as any argument of its impracticability. Yes, that's it. Impracticability. It was with these feelings that I began the creation of a human being. As the minuteness of the parts formed a great hindrance to my speed, I resolved, contrary to my first intention, to make the being of a gigantic stature, that is to say, about 8 feet in height, and proportionably large. After having formed this determination and having spent some months in successful collecting and arranging my materials, I began. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards, like a hurricane, in the first enthusiasm of success. Life and death appeared to me ideal bounds, which I should first break through, and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. Pursuing these reflections, I thought that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might in process of time, although I now found it impossible, renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. These thoughts supported my spirits while I pursued my undertaking with unremitting ardor. My cheek had grown pale with study, and my person had become emaciated with confinement. Sometimes on the very brink of certainty I felt, yet still I claimed to the hope which the day or the next hour might realize. One secret which I alone possessed was the hope to which I had dedicated myself, and the moon gazed on my midnight labors, while, with unrelaxed and breathless eagerness, I pursued nature to her hiding places. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay? My limbs now tremble and my eyes swim with the remembrance, but then a restlessness, an almost frantic impulse, urged me forward. I seemed to have lost all soul or sensation but for this one pursuit. It was indeed but a passing trance, that only made me feel with renewed acuteness so soon as, the unnatural stimulus ceasing to operate, I had returned to my old habits. I collected the bones from charnel houses, and disturbed with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame. In a solitary chamber, or rather cell, at the top of the house, and separate from all the other apartments by the gallery and staircase, I kept my workshop of filthy creation. My eyeballs were staring from their sockets and attending to the details of my employment. The dissecting room and the slaughter-house furnished many of my materials, and often did my human nature turn with loathing from my occupation, while, still urged on by an eagerness which perpetually increased, I brought my work near to a conclusion. The summer months passed while I was thus engaged, heart and soul, in one pursuit. It was a most beautiful season. Never did the fields bestow a more plentiful harvest, or the vines yield a more luxuriant vintage, but my eyes were insensible to the charms of nature, and the same feelings which made me neglect the scenes around me caused me also to forget those friends who were so many miles absent, and whom I had not seen for so long. I knew my silence disquieted them, and I well remembered the words of my father. I know that while you are pleased with yourself, you will think of us with affection, and we shall regularly hear from you. You must pardon me if I regard any interruption in your correspondence as a proof that your other duties are equally neglected. I knew well, therefore, what would be my father's feelings, but I could not tear my thoughts from my employment, loathsome in itself, but which had taken an irresistible hold of my imagination. I wished, as it were, to procrastinate all that related to my feelings of affection until the great objects which swallowed up every habit of my nature should be completed. I then thought of my father, who would be unjust if he ascribed my neglect to vice or faultiness on my part, but I am now convinced that he was justified in conceiving that I should not be altogether free from blame. A human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never to allow passion or transitory desire to disturb his tranquility. I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections, and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful, that is to say, not benefiting the human mind. If this rule were always observed, if no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with tranquillity of his domestic affections, Greece had not been enslaved, Caesar would not have snared his country, America would not have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed. But I forget that I am moralizing in the most interesting part of my tale, and your looks remind me to proceed. My father made no reproach in this letter, and only took notice of my silence by inquiring into my occupations more practically than before. Winter, spring, and summer passed away during my labors, but I did not watch the blossom or the expanding leaves. Sights which before always yielded me supreme delight. So deeply was I engrossed in my occupation. The leaves of that year had withered before my work drew to a close, and now every day showed me more plainly how well I had succeeded. But my enthusiasm was checked by my anxiety, and I appeared rather like one doomed by slavery to toil in the mines, or any other unwholesome trade, than an artist occupied by his favorite employment. Every night I was oppressed by a slow fever, and I became nervous to a most painful degree. The fall of the leaf startled me, and I shunned my fellow creatures as if I had been guilty of a crime. Sometimes I grew alarmed at the wreck I perceived that I had become. The energy of my purpose alone sustained me. My labors would soon end, and I believed that exercise and amusement would then drive away incipient disease, and I promised myself both of these when my creation should be complete. Well, when we return to this, perhaps next week, we'll do another story time, but that just depends on who we get on. But yeah, we might do story time next Sunday. That'll take us to chapter 5. But on that note, boys and girls, we are going to our second music break. On this break, we have Miss Mia Savage, Antidote for Savages. She's my favorite. Can't help it. I'm obsessed with her as a person, with her music, with everything. She is just amazing. She's my best friend. So she is going to be singing Lemurian Crypto, Not a Phase, Let Me Be Your Home, and the bottom line, you guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this music break.
leave me alone. Somebody please take me out. Rest of time.
Welcome back, and thank you so much for joining us this evening on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. This evening, we have been partaking of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This hour, we shall be partaking of Reddit's Halloween stories. If you haven't made your way over to the Face of Horror, make sure you go over there to faceofhorror.org/2022/Tessa-Thomas-Peterson. That's faceofhorror.org/Tessa-Thomas-Peterson. Put your votes in. There's free daily votes every day. They're very strict on the 24-hour thing. So, you get one vote if you do it by Facebook. You get 2 votes if you do it by credit card. If you do put your credit card in, just know it's not charged unless you charge it. It's a legitimate thing. Some people don't believe in it. A lot of people have done it and have no ill effects. So make sure you go on over there and support your favorite mistress of the night. So the first story we have going on here for Halloween stories is Seasonal Halloween Store 2022. I remember the doors opening, jack-o'-lanterns and animatronics waving me into the world of spooky wonder. It was only October 4th, and I was already so excited for trick-or-treating I could barely breathe. I looked at the sign above, the generic Halloween Store logo haphazardly plastered over the once bright and wonderful sign of Heidi's Palace, a back-in-the-day hybrid clone of both Chuck E. Cheese's and Toys R Us, one that apparently didn't exist anymore. I could recall the commercial for the grand opening, the comically tall mascot in a suit with an eyeball for a head cutting a big ribbon with a large set of golden scissors. I remembered the cartoons airing on TV, but was too young to know it had gone bankrupt and closed, leaving a shell in a corner of the otherwise busy mall. The thought of it being painted so easily made me feel strange, but the dancing ghosts and zombies inside were quickly changing my tune. "Come on, buddy, let's go see some scary stuff." My dad patted me on the back, and together we went in. As soon as I was through the doors, a blur of movement flashed before me, and a clown screamed with outstretched arms. I nearly jumped out of my skin, and my dad laughed. I recoiled at his menacing face, one that quickly melted away and said, "If you need help finding anything, let me know," before chuckling and dancing away. I felt tears welling, but my dad said it was just a joke and assured me he was just trying to spread some Halloween spirit. In seconds, I had forgotten about the old Heidi cartoon, my world consumed by bags of candy corn and hanging costumes. The Halloween store was a magical place, with loads of decorations and disgusting props, even a lady dressed as a witch behind the counter. My dad corralled me around the skeletons and prop heads, letting me get close, but not letting me touch anything. "These things are expensive. If we break it, we buy it." It was something he always said, a voice that echoed in my head every time I reached for the light-up pumpkins or giant spiders. It didn't matter if I couldn't touch them. Just being in the big spooky world made my heart race so fast I thought I would pee myself. Hundreds of costume choices, anywhere from a zombie pirate to a giant hot dog. The bigger kids were crowded around the wall of masks, so my dad decided to avoid it and distracted me with the costumes from popular scary movies. I kept expecting the clown to pop out again, but never saw him. We made several laps around the store, and each time I saw something I'd missed previously. With each round, my dad got more and more tired, and I could hear the patience thinning in his voice. I still hadn't found a costume. I could tell we were about to go, and I was doing everything I could to keep us in the scary wonderland. Just as he was steering me towards the register, I thought of something that made my world crash down. We had never looked at the masks. I looked at the wall of masks and saw the bigger kids had cleared out. I thought of the clown lingering and decided to chance it for an opportunity to see them. My dad was talking sweetly to the witch cashier, and she was leaning towards him. twirling a long lock in her fingers. I tugged on his hand to get his attention, one he pacified by squeezing my hand in warning. Well, I never thought I could really pull off a lumberjack, but... Dad, can I please go look at the mask, please? I blurted, making both of them look at me. I could see my dad's flash of anger, one that seemed to fizzle away when the witch put her hand on his. He sighed and reluctantly agreed. Only for a minute, and don't touch anything. But I was already gone, ready to have the whole wall of masks to myself. I dashed through rows of costume, blinking lights, and weaved through other customers as I made my way to the wall. I could see them clearer now, all of my Halloween spirit writhing in a torrent of anxious excitement. I burst out of an aisle and into an open wall, feeling dwarfed under the size of the collection. I looked for a clown and saw no sight of him. Without my dad trailing behind me, I suddenly felt very alone, the wall of masks staring down at me. I looked over each face. Some I recognized. Some I didn't. A man with nails protruding from his face, the wild-eyed face of a man wearing someone else's face, a black unicorn with burning stars for eyes. I looked at each one, marveling at both the detail in the masks and the feeling of dread it inspired in me. Despite my growing fear, I kept looking, each one more unsettling than the last. An unsettling white face with brown hair, a man with horribly burned skin. Something between the hangers caught my eye. I found myself stopping. There was something hiding in the shadow, the faintest glint, catching the lights from overhead, like a mask had fallen down behind the others. It was roundish and looked like it had a dot in the middle. I tried to see it better, but it was just too dark. I had to get closer. I looked for my dad and realized I was too far away from the register to see him. The store suddenly felt very empty, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I decided I would just take a peek and run back to him. I turned around and parted the other mask with my hands, trying to get a better look. It was round, like a beach ball, a singular dot right in the center. I've moved my face closer, the familiar shape slowly making sense in my head. After a moment, I realized it wasn't a dot, but a pupil. It reminded me of Heidi's playhouse, but the realistic features made it look more unsettling than friendly, and there wasn't another like it in the whole store. It was perfect, and I wanted it to be my costume. I reached for the mask, but it was too far away. I tried to worm my way between the hangers, keeping the mask in my view as I inched between them. When I reached again, one of the hangers caught my shirt, preventing me from going further. When I tried to shake it off, I felt something grab my hand. I looked to see long black fingers wrapped around my hand, an icy grip that came from the shadows of the rack. I felt a sickening pit in my stomach and tried to pull away, but it wouldn't let go. The pupil in the Heidi mask dilated and blinked. Before I could scream, the hand yanked me into the wall and I blacked out. When I awoke, I felt the cold press of the floor on my face. I jumped to my feet and looked around, feeling a kindling panic when I didn't recognize where I was. I was in an aisle, black and white checkered tile, reaching for as long as I could see. There were shelves on either side to me, neatly organized toys stacked high until they almost touched the fluorescence above. "Dad?" I called out, my voice meeting nothing but silence. The aisle seemed to stretch forever, hundreds of toys lining the path both ways. I found myself shivering, wanting desperately to go home. Next to me was a cardboard cutout, bold letters announcing the grand opening, Heidi's Palace. Join Heidi and his sidekick Shep the sheepdog on the greatest game of hide-and-go-seek ever. The cutout depicted an unusually tall and lanky man dressed in a suit, with a large eyeball serving as his head. Beside him was an adorable-looking sheepdog with sparkling eyes that stood on its hind legs like a person. It looked just like the cartoon I had seen on TV. At the bottom of the sign read its catchy slogan, "No one can hide from Heidi." Creepy. The scream echoed down the aisle, and I looked to see the clown from the store. He was running towards me, flailing his hands. I'm not sure what frightened me more, the sight of him or the fact that he looked terrified. Kid, oh my God, kid, we gotta get out of here, he shouted, grabbing me by the shoulders. He was breathing hard, streaks of tears streaking down his clown makeup. I started to cry. Kid, tell me, how did you get here? We need to find a way out. He's coming, he shouted frantically, looking back down the direction he came. There was nothing but darkness, a billowing, shifting void that seemed to churn at the end of the aisle. Who's coming? I blubbered, lips trembling. I I don't know who he is. He's just not fucking right. We gotta go, kid. We gotta. Suddenly, a large hand gripped the clown's shoulder and yanked him away, pulling so hard his oversized shoes kicked off his feet. The arm that grabbed him stretched from the darkness and held him up in the air, wrapping around his throat until he choked from breath. No, please! I retched in horror as the arm slammed him down, an impact so hard it rattled the boxes on the shelves. The clown coughed and clutched at his stomach, and the long arm slithered away into the darkness. Run, kid, run! He coughed, but he wasn't looking at me. From the darkness poked a large pair of golden shears, reflecting in the fluorescent light. The blades opened like a guillotine, worked by two long hands that gripped the loop fiercely. Out stepped an incredibly thin body, standing tall, with massive bloodshed, spherical eyeballs. I froze with fear as the scarcely shaped Heidi crouched to keep his head from hitting the ceiling. He cast a shadow over the clown as he approached, who was holding his hand out in surrender. You thought you could hide from me? It spoke with no mouth, the massive eye narrowing in front of him. No! The blades closed, shearing the clown's arm and head from his body. The separated pieces flailed and sprayed, but Heidi was already opening the shears again to give it another go. He closed them again and then again, flinging a spatter of minced guts and bloody spray as he kept snapping the giant scissors. As red speckles peppered his giant eye, Heidi looked at me and stopped, snapping the shears at the air. I turned and ran, heading into the opposite direction as the piercing shriek emitted from the eyeball. The limbs skittered like a spider, closing the distance in seconds as I screamed. I woke in my father's arms, crying hysterically. We were sitting on the floor, and he was rocking me back and forth as a crowd gathered around us. I was back in the Halloween store. The checkered tile beneath me was once again old, scuffed carpet. Heidi was nowhere to be found. My dad asked me what happened, saying he found me on the floor crying by the mast. I told him everything. Heidi with his scissors and the clown in the long store-like hallway. The girl witch cashier suggested maybe I had gotten lost in the back and found some of the old store cutouts. She said Harv, the clown, was supposed to be grabbing more items to restock, and she would go get him to apologize. She returned moments later confused, saying he was nowhere to be found. Underneath the wall of masks, a red stain was growing in the carpet. The Swinging Girl. Once I came upon a girl swinging in the park near my house. The late summer trees surrounded the playground like a cradle of leaves, and the moon was half full. She wasn't swinging very hard. She just swayed a bit to and fro over the ground, her feet tapping the wooden plank underneath that had been put there to obstruct the mud. Tap, tap her feet went as she swung back and forth. She was smiling, her head slightly lowered, her eyes gazing at something on the ground. I climbed onto the swing next to her and said, "Hello." "Hi," she said, not looking at me. "Why are you smiling?" I asked her. "I don't know." "It's kind of creepy," I said. She shrugged. "I like being creepy." "Why?" "It's happy, but not proper happy," she said. "Oh," I said, confused. I turned my attention to the swing and concentrated on moving back and forth, my legs going up and down until my mind was empty and content. Then, when I was done, I scraped my shoes against the ground until I was still. I got up. "Goodbye," I said. "Bye," she said. Days went by, and the leaves fell until the ground was a brilliant orange and the branches were bare against the lamplit sky. Sometimes I'd pass and she wouldn't be there. Sometimes she'd be there, still smiling, a soft smile. I'd get on the swing next to her, and we'd swing, not talking, just silently moving back and forth. Sometimes when I got into the feeling of it would feel like time had stopped or never existed, and I didn't exist either. I was just a pendulum hanging from the metal rod above, separate from reality. One day, I felt particularly bad, but I still said hello to her as usual and got onto my swing. I felt grumpy and lonely. Why did she never talk? Why didn't she ask me about my day? I was always here for her, wasn't I? I suddenly felt frustrated by her quietness and her empty smile. "Stop smiling," I said. "Why?" she said. "Stop it," I said louder. "Why?" she said. "Stop smiling," I shouted, and like a crack on a cup of porcelain, her smile shivered and broke, and the tapping of her feet on the wooden plank stopped. She stood up from the swing, her mouth opened ajar, eyes unblinking, and the wooden plank under her feet creaked open like a door into the ground. The moaning began in her throat, low and unearthly, until it bellowed in my ears like the moaning of the wind. I didn't like the sound. "Stop it," I said. "Stop that at once." "Daddy," she said, "I'm sorry I broke it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." "Be quiet," I said. "Sorry, sorry, sorry, sorry." "Close your mouth," I said, and wrapped my hands around her face and tightened them to muffle the sound. When I opened my hands, I saw nothing but scraps of a cafeteria lunch fall onto the ground, and walls wherever I looked. Zarathustra. He stared intently at me. As his hand flashed, I fell, crashing to the ground, a dagger protruding from under my ribs. I grabbed a shard of broken glass on the decrepit floor and stabbed it into him. On the floor next to me was a red book titled, "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," on its spine. Zarathustra? What was that? I woke up thinking it was a made-up word like in most of my dreams, and forgot about it by the time I was pouring out my Cheerios. At Todd's after school, I saw a red book on his shelf. Zarathustra. Zarathustra. I'd had a dream about Zarathustra. Wait, Zarathustra is real? When I left for home, I was plagued by one question. What is real? If I had dreamed something with a parallel in my waking life, how did I know the dream was a dream and my life was my life? When I touched my hands, they felt real. The sky was always blue, and the water was always wet. If it were consistent, it must be real, right? This I assured myself now in words, although that had already been the unspoken understanding in the past. But now it didn't feel like enough. I felt uneasy. In dreams, it can feel like things are consistent too. What if I was making things up right now? The streets of my suburban neighborhood suddenly seemed too crisp, the houses too defined, the sidewalks too condensed. Am I real? I muttered out loud. Nothing happened. Not at first, that is. It happened a little at a time. I started breaking apart. First, my shoes lowered themselves from my legs, my feet still in them, and then my head dispersed, the eyes growing farther apart, my nose floating somewhere in the middle, my lips drifting off to the side. I could feel it, and it didn't hurt, as if I were gas molecules just floating around. Andy! I turned, my body back to normal. It was Todd. Are you okay? He asked me. Yeah, I said, finding myself just standing on the sidewalk staring at a tree. Totally. He joined me and looked at the tree. Red tree, huh? He said. Yeah, I said, smiling. Todd always felt so right, not in a I wanted to bone him kind of way or anything. It just always felt right when he was next to me. He was my brother. Are you real? I said as he stood there next to me, his face hidden under his hoodie. He turned to me unexpectedly, but I didn't want to turn to look at him. I don't know why. I was afraid. I kept looking at the tree, and he turned back to the tree. Do you remember? He said. His voice was light. Remember what? Remember Mr. Johnson's face today as he yelled at Aaron? Wasn't it Aaron? How'd you know it was Aaron versus Aaron? I frowned. I don't know. But now I realized something strange. I had just read him somehow instead of hearing him, like a book. And the information was somehow now in the brain that he had said Aaron with an E. But also, how did he know I'd said Aaron with an A? Todd, I said, turning to him, what's happening? You know, he whispered. You found out. I was silent. I didn't want to know, but now I did. Suddenly, like a memory in and of itself. Who we were and what we were. Don't leave me alone, he said. I don't want to be apart. Where are we? I whispered. It was dark and white and cold. Zarathustra, he said, the beginning of the end and the end of the beginning. You've been here before? I asked. We have, he said. Always we come this way. He looked at me intently. As his hand flashed, I fell, crashing to the ground, a dagger protruding from under my ribs. I grabbed a shard of broken glass on the sidewalk and stabbed it into him. On the floor next to me was a red book titled Thus Spoke Zarathustra on its spine. Zarathustra. Was that a person or a place? I woke up thinking it was a made-up word, like in most of my dreams, and forgot about it by the time I was eating my scrambled eggs. At Andy's after school, I saw the red book on his shelf. Zarathustra. Zarathustra. I'd had a dream about Zarathustra. Wait, Zarathustra is real? When I left for home, I was plagued by one question. What is real? If I had dreamed something with a parallel in my waking life, how did I know the dream was a dream and my life was my life? When I touched my face, it felt real. The snow was always cold and came early up here in Minnesota. If it were consistent, it must be real, right? This I assured myself now in words, although that had already been the unspoken understanding in the past. But now it didn't feel like enough. I felt uneasy. In dreams, I can feel like things are consistent too. What if I was making things up right now? The streets of my suburban neighborhood suddenly seemed too crisp, The house is too defined, the sidewalks too condensed. Am I real? I muttered out loud. Nothing happened. Not at first, that is. It happened a little at a time. I started breaking apart. First my shoes lowered themselves from my legs, my feet still in them, and then my head dispersed. The eyes growing farther apart, my nose floating somewhere in the middle, my lips drifting off to the side. I could feel it, and it didn't hurt, as if I were gas molecules just floating around. Todd! I turned my back to normal. It was Andy. Are you okay? He asked me. Yeah, I said, finding myself standing on the sidewalk staring at a fence. Totally. He joined me and looked at the fence. Rad fence, huh? He said, admiring the mural of a witch flying away over a city landscape. Yeah, I said, smiling. Andy always felt so right, not in a I wanted to bone him kind of way or anything. Just always felt right when he was next to me. He was my brother. Does reality exist? I said, as he stood there next to me, his face hidden under his hoodie. He turned to me unexpectedly, but I didn't want to turn to look at him. I don't know why. I was afraid. I kept looking at the tree. He turned back to the tree. Do you remember? He said. His voice was light. Remember what? Remember Johnson's face today as he yelled at Aaron? Wasn't it Aaron? How'd you know it was Aaron versus Aaron? I frowned. I don't know. But now I realized something strange. I had just read him, somehow instead of hearing him, like a book, and the information was somehow now in my brain. That he had said Aaron with an A, but also, how did he know I'd said Aaron with an E? Andy, I said, turning to him, what's happening? You know, he whispered. You found out. I was silent. I didn't want to know, but now I did. Suddenly, like a memory in and of itself, who we were and what we were. Where are we? I whispered. It was dark and white and cold. Don't leave me alone, he said. I don't want to be apart. Zarathustra, he said. The beginning of the end and the end of the beginning, I said. How do we get out of this? I whispered. I'm trying, he said, one step at a time. He stared intently at me. As his hand flashed, I fell, crashing to the ground, a dagger protruding from under my ribs. I grabbed a piece of broken picket fence and stabbed it into him. On the floor next to me was the red book titled, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, on its spine. Hello, Robert. That was a trippy story, eh? Could have been Ron. That's right. That's right. Always carry duct tape or super glue, just in case you start to fly apart in particulates. This one's called The Halloween Club. The orange on the horizon grew smaller and smaller. The darkness of the night was claiming the Halloween sky. Little Jessica traversed through the briar-carpeted forest and over the crumbling cemetery terrain. She finally caught up with her older brother and his friends. Dude, what's that dork doing here? Asked his friend with an attitude. Yeah, she's totally too girly for the Halloween club, said his other friend. Jessica's lip began to quiver and her knees began to shake. You never let me do anything you do. It's not fair. You always have so much fun without me. An evil grin grew on her brother's face. Well, since you followed us all the way out here, you might as well join. Jessica's face lit up with happiness. But first, you must do something really, really bad. Jessica thought for a second. "Oh, I know what to do. I'll be right back. It's going to be a surprise," she said before running back the way she came. Jessica snuck into her house through the garage. She grabbed a hacksaw right before opening the door which led to the kitchen. From there, she could see David watching TV on the couch. She didn't like him. She thought her old father was better. Why did Mom have to marry him? Jessica looked around. Mom wasn't home, just David. Jessica tiptoed towards him. His back was facing her. He just sat there and absorbed the garbage the screen telecasted. He was not at all aware of his surroundings. Later, Jessica scampered up the hill once again. Her brother and his friends were still there. She went up to them, placing her candy bag on the ground. "Look what I did," she proclaimed before pushing the bag over, causing a severed head to roll out. David's severed head. All the boys jumped back and screamed in horror. "Can I join the club now? I bet none of you have ever done something this bad." Jessica's brother directed his gaze from the head to her. His face was granite. Jessica, I was just messing with you when I said that." Well, that'll teach you to leave the little sister out of all your antics. That was pretty sick. Luckily, it wasn't Aaron that did it. It was Jessica. Yes. Oh, what a head. What a head of laughter. The last days of Jackson S. It was nearly midnight when I finally finished the last of the paperwork for our new inmate, Jackson S. He was scheduled to arrive later this evening. According to the police records, he was caught smuggling drugs over the border, and when confronted by customs, threatened one of them with a gun. He was said to be fairly dangerous, so he must be isolated from the others. But when Jackson was delivered to the prison 2 hours later, he was nothing like what I had imagined. He was a small, skinny man with a gaunt, pale face and eyes that had seen the horrors of the world. He was already wearing the pajamas that all the other inmates were wearing. The guards shoved him into his cell, and almost immediately he requested to see me. The moment I stepped into his cell, he broke down in tears. He confessed his life story before he was arrested. How his daughter was sick from cancer and he was in debt trying to pay for her treatment. How a close friend said he would help Jackson cover his daughter's treatment if he did exactly as he said. Jackson begged me to help him. He wanted to see his daughter again. I laughed in his face, spat on it for good measure. "No can do, bud. Can't help you." Jackson had a hearing the following day, the final one to determine his fate. He was up against a sea of stone-cold faces who read out his crimes and debated in godlike voices. The trial only took 30 minutes. The decision was clear. For his crimes, Jackson would be hanged. Jackson's face turned as white as a ghost. He begged, he screamed, he reiterated his desire to see his daughter. Tears cascaded down his face as he pleaded for his life. He was still yelling as the guards dragged him away. He was scheduled to be hanged this Friday. He spent the days leading to his death facing the wall without speaking, his shoulders sagging. When the time came, we unlocked the doors and led him outside to where the noose was waiting. He said nothing as the hangman eased his neck into the rope. Finally, as the hangman stood behind him ready to pull out his chair from underneath him, he raised his head for the last time. His expression said it all: hurt, resignation, betrayal. I turned away as his neck snapped. He did not even scream. The last time I saw Jackson was the following night. I was in my office filing paperwork for yet another inmate. Jackson walked in. My hair immediately stood on end. Jackson said nothing, turned, and disappeared outside. I got up and followed him. We headed down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in gloom. Finally, we came to a heavy metal door. Jackson disappeared inside. I grunted as I pushed the door and went in. The cold stung my skin like 1,000 needles and cut into my cheek like a knife. The second thing I noticed was the smell. It was extremely pungent, and I started to gag. My hand felt the light switch, and what lay before me turned my face white. Bodies were stacked in rows, each in varying stages of decomposition. Some were missing their faces and heads, and the ones that did were staring at me with vacant eyes. I tried to open the door, but it had locked itself from outside. I yelled for help, but no one would come, not at this time of night. Jackson's voice floated through the cracks. "You never helped me. Now no one will help you." He left, leaving me alone in the blistering cold. My baby. "Push!" The doctor spoke fast. I grunted, pain shooting in waves up my spine. "Push!" I pushed as hard as I could. I grunted again, sweat beading on my face. This was painful, but it would all be worth it. Finally, the blood-soaked baby slid out. It started to wail. The doctor cracked a thin smile. Her face was moist with sweat. "Congratulations, ma'am. It's a boy." Tears streaked down my face as I cradled my newborn son. "Thank you," I whispered. The moment I got home, I couldn't help but cry again. I hated this part. I always hated this part, but it had to be done. I wrapped my hands around my newborn's neck, twisted. It snapped instantly. His wails died down. I carried my baby into the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I prepared the cake. I crushed his bones into powder and added it to the flour. I poured in his blood together with the milk. I stared at the oven as the minutes ticked by, willing for it not to burn. Finally, the timer rang. I carried the cake out of the oven and opened the door to the basement. Light shone downwards in an eternal holy stream, illuminating the only thing in the room. My son Harry, the only son I would ever know, strained against his restraints, snarling and biting. His eyes gleamed in the darkness. "Hush, Harry," I said, trying not to cry. "Mummy's here. Dinner's here." He liked them young. The younger the better. Baby cake was his favorite food. But he would settle for anything. I'd already lost several digits because I didn't produce babies fast enough. I watched as my Harry snapped up the cake. Then I turned away, breaking into sobs. Anything for my dear Harry. Well, that was gross-gusting. I don't know about you guys, but I didn't expect that. Anywho's, thank you guys so much for joining me this evening on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. It was a pleasure reading to you this evening. Thanks, Robert, for your interaction there. That was fun. And thank you to all of our friends on We Are Paradox Media's KPNL Radio, Facebook, Twitter, Periscope, iHeartRadio, and wherever else you may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. I had a wonderful time this evening, and I can't wait to do it again tomorrow night when we got Funk Master V, Vinny V, and we got Big Luke, aka Luke Walker, on with Netflix and Chill. It's gonna be awesome. Can't wait. You guys, don't forget, we are all in this together. Together, we can make the world a little better. And together, my friends, we are Paradox Media, because without you, there is no us. If you'd like to join us on the Skype after party, look me up at live:_Tessa.N.Thomas30, or give us a little jingle jangle at 970-335-9596. That's 1-970-335-9596. Until next time, nighty night, love and light. You guys take care of my yous, and I will see you back here tomorrow night. Same crazy time, same batty place.